The history of Norwegian black metal is often told through the same few names: Mayhem, Burzum, Dark Throne, Emperor, Immortal. But history does not end when the first chapter is over, and that's where Taake enters the story. To understand Taake, we have to go back to 1993. By then, Norwegian black metal had already established itself as one of the most distinctive and controversial movements in extreme music. While the scene continued to evolve, a young musician in Bergen named Ørjan began a project called Thule. At the time, Ørjan performed under the name Ulv Hedin. Together with drummer Svartulv, he formed Thule and released the project's first demo, Da Vinterstormen raste, in 1993. That was followed by a second demo, Omfavnet av svarte vinger, in 1994. Later that same year, Thule became Taake, and Ulv Hedin adopted the name Hoest. Both names fit the music almost perfectly. Taake is the Norwegian word for fog, while Hoest means autumn. And both are closely tied to the atmosphere of Bergen and western Norway. Rain, mountains, forests, cold air, and a landscape that often feels half hidden. In 1995, Taake released its first demo under their new band name. Munndødsvinter was the name of that demo. The following year came the EP Koldbrann I Jesu Marg. After that release, Svartulv left the band, leaving Hoest as the sole driving force behind Taake. The early years were now behind him. What came next would define Taake's identity for decades. The first three full-length albums are often viewed as a trilogy. Not This Tid, Bergen, or Dødskvad. But this section of Taake's history is not just important because it gave us these three albums. It is important because this is where the early foundation becomes a complete artistic identity. The sound, the language, the atmosphere, and the connection to Bergen and Western Norway, all of it becomes inseparable from the band. Taake's first full-length album, Not This Tid, was released in 1999. This is the album where the core Taake sound starts to fully take shape. It is raw, cold, and unmistakably black metal, but it is also melodic and restless in a way that gives the music a lot of movement. The riffs do not just sit in one place, they twist, shift, and develop, almost like they're moving through the landscape themselves. And from the beginning, Taake was not trying to sound detached from where it came from. The lyrics were in Norwegian, the atmosphere was Norwegian, the imagery was Norwegian. More specifically, it was rooted in Bergen and the west coast. That identity extended beyond the music itself. Taake's lyrics were written exclusively in Norwegian, rooted in a deeply pessimistic philosophy and the landscape that shaped Hoest's worldview. Rather than simply accompanying the music, they became another part of Taake's artistic identity. Even the printed lyrics appeared in runic script, reinforcing the feeling that Taake wasn't merely releasing albums, it was creating an artistic world of its own. That connection to a place is one of the things that separates Taake from bands that simply borrow black metal aesthetics. With Taake, the landscape does not feel like decoration around the music. It feels like part of the music itself. I asked Hoest how much Bergen and Western Norway shaped Taake. He answered in Norwegian, and I wanted to include parts of it in his own words. Siden jeg vokste opp på familiens 200 gamle bondegård i en liten dal ved et skogkledd fjell, mellom en innsjø og havet, har jeg alltid følt et sterkt bånd til fordomstider og vår kaotiske vestlandsnatur. He describes growing up on his family's 200-year-old farm in a small valley beside a forested mountain between a lake and the sea. Because of that, he says, he always felt a strong connection to ancient times and the chaotic nature of Western Norway. Både stemningen jeg alltid har ønsket å uttrykke i toner og omgivelsene som gjengis i all min lyrikk, preges i aller høyeste grad av mitt opphav. In other words, both the atmosphere he tries to express through his music and the landscapes that appear throughout his lyrics are shaped by where he comes from. That explains a lot about Taake. The atmosphere does not feel borrowed from Western Norway. It feels rooted there. The rain, the mountains, the forest, the sea, the old farms, the ancient history, all of that gives the music a sense of place. Not in a tourist brochure kind of way, obviously, more like the feeling of growing up somewhere where nature is always close, the weather is always present, and history feels like it's buried in the ground underneath you. That becomes even clearer on the second album of the trilogy, Bergen. The title itself points directly back to Bergen. Bergen is the old name for Bergen, and the album feels even more connected to the city and the surrounding landscape. If Nattestid established the sound, Bergen deepened that identity. This is also where you start to hear one of the things I really like about Taake, Hoest's willingness to bring unexpected sounds into black metal without making them feel like gimmicks. On the third track of Bergen, Taake briefly brings in a jaw harp, an old folk instrument with a sharp metallic twang. On paper, that sounds like it should not work in black metal at all, but in the song, it does. It does not suddenly turn the music into folk metal. It does not break the atmosphere. It adds texture, character, and something distinctly regional. It is one of those small movements that makes Taake feel difficult to mistake for anyone else. The album also ends in a way that shows another side of the band. The seventh and the final track strips away most of the aggression and let the atmosphere take over. Rain, slow guitars, and distant choral voices close the album with something that feels melancholic. It isn't just an ending, it feels like the album dissolving back into the landscape that it came from. Then, in 2005, Taake released Dutch Squad, completing the trilogy, where Bergen is tied close to Bergen. Hordaland's Dutch Squad expands the focus outward to Hordaland, the old county Bergen was a part of, and the wider West Coast identity. By this point, the three albums feel connected, but not interchangeable. Nattestid opens the gate. Bergen brings the music deeper into Bergen. Dutch Squad widens the scope and completes the statement. Together, they establish Taake's visual, regional, and musical identity. And even during this early defining period, Taake was already willing to bring unexpected sounds into black metal. Piano, jaw harp, unusual percussions, theatrical vocal textures. These moments usually appear briefly. They're not there to take over the song, but they give the album personality, and they show that Hoest was never just copying the first wave of Norwegian black metal. Taake is clearly rooted in that tradition. The rawness is there, the coldness and the aggression is there, but the trilogy also shows something more fluid and expressive. The music can be harsh, melodic, ugly, beautiful, chaotic, and strangely elegant, sometimes all within the same song. By 2005, Taake's identity was firmly established. The question was no longer what the band was. The question was where Hoest would take it next. For a lot of bands, defining your sound can become a trap. Once people know what to expect from you, there's always pressure to keep giving them exactly that. Change too much, people say you lost the spirit. Stay close to the formula and the music starts to feel like imitation of yourself. Taake's next phase is interesting because Hoest manages to keep the identity intact while still opening the music up. In 2008, Taake released their self-titled album, and already this feels like the beginning of a different chapter. The trilogy had a clear structure, 3 albums connected by place, language, and atmosphere. The self-titled album feels less like the continuation of that structure and more like Hoest stepping outside of it. Beginning with the self-titled album, Hoest also assumed responsibility for all of Taake's core instrumentation himself, with only occasional guest musicians appearing on Norges Våpen and Stridens Hus. The foundation is still there, the riffs, the vocals, the rawness, sense of movement is still unmistakably Taake, but the sound starts to feel broader. There's more variation, more room for guest musicians, more willingness to let different textures enter the music without losing the core of what Taake is. And that's one of the things I found find most interesting about Hoest as a songwriter. Taake remained rooted in traditional Norwegian black metal, but Hoest never treated tradition as a set of rules. You can hear that even earlier in the trilogy with moments like the jaw harp on Bergen. The same instinct continues after the trilogy. Taake brings in piano, unusual percussion, guest vocals, and later, most famously the banjo on Mir. And yes, banjo in black metal sounds ridiculous if you just say it out loud, but that's kind of the point. The surprise is not that Taake used a banjo, the surprise is that it worked. It does not turn the song into bluegrass, it does not make the music feel unserious, it adds this strange, sharp, almost defiant character to the track. That has always been one of Taake's strengths. The unexpected elements do not replace the black metal, they get absorbed into it. The music stretches, but it does not break. As Taake continued releasing albums after the trilogy, the core identity remained clear. The vocals were still unmistakable, the riff still had the winding, restless quality, the Norwegian language and regional character remained central. The atmosphere still tied to Bergen, rain, mountains, old stone and the western coastline, but the records did not all feel like attempts to remake the trilogy. And I think that's important, because consistency is not the same thing as repetition. Taake stayed recognizable without becoming frozen in place. And that's a difficult balance, especially in a genre where authenticity can sometimes be treated like a cage. Hoest kept the traditional black metal foundation, but allowed enough movement, variation, and personality to keep the project alive. And by this point, Taake was no longer just a name within the Norwegian underground. The band's audience had grown beyond Norway. The music had traveled and the reputation with it. And as Taake became more visibly internationally, so did the attention surrounding Hoest. And not all of it focused on the music. For a band like Taake, this is not a side note, but it also cannot become the entire documentary. The controversies are part of the public history of the band, and they need to be addressed honestly, but they are not the whole story. The most well-known incident happened in 2007 during a performance in Essen, Germany. At that show, Hoest appeared on stage with a swastika painted on his chest. The backlash was immediate. Shows were cancelled, Taake faced bans and exclusion from parts of the German live circuit, and for many people outside the scene, this became the image attached to the band. Hoest later denied any affiliation with Nazism. His explanation was that the symbol was used as provocation, not as a political statement of belief. And that distinction matters, but it is also where things get complicated. Black metal has always had a relationship with taboo imagery. The genre was built around rejection, confrontation, anti-Christian symbolism, and a refusal to make itself comfortable for outsiders. But intent and reception are not always the same thing. An artist can use a symbol for provocation, but the audience still brings the history of that symbol with them. And in Germany especially, the history is not abstract. It's immediate, real, and impossible to separate from the image itself. So the question becomes larger than one performance. Where is the line between black metal as provocation and the real-world consequences of that provocation? That question followed Taake beyond the Essen incident. In 2012, Taake was nominated for a Spellemann Award, Norway's major music prize. It's pretty much the same thing as the Grammys in the United States. The nomination was criticized because of lyric in the song Orkan, which included the line Til helvete med Mohammed og Muhammedanernes utilgivelige skikkelser. In English, to hell with Muhammad and Muhammadans unforgivable customs. Critics saw the lyric as anti-Islamic. Hoest responded by pointing out that Christianity is also attacked in the same song, and that Taake had never been a political band. His argument was, essentially, that black metal has always attacked religion, and he saw no reason why Islam should be treated differently from Christianity. Again, this brings us back to that same tension. From Hoest's perspective, this was black metal doing what black metal has always done, attacking religion, rejecting sacred boundaries, refusing to spare anything from blasphemy. But from the outside, the lyric was not always heard as anti-religious provocation. It was heard by some as targeting Muslims specifically. That difference between intention and reception became a reoccurring part of Taake's public image. In 2018, Taake's planned US tour was cancelled after activists campaigned against the band because of the earlier controversies. Venues began pulling out, pressure increased, and the tour eventually collapsed. Hoest, again, rejected the accusation, stating that Taake was not a racist band and never had been. A similar pattern again appeared in 2023 when a planned Australian tour was cancelled after renewed complaints and public pressure. When I asked Hoest about the way these accusations had followed Taake, his response was blunt. De fleste bransjeaktører virker omsider å ha forstått sannheten om Taake, og ikke minst om våre forkastelige såkalte motstandere. Bunch of freaks and weirdos. In other words, Hoest believes most people in the industry have eventually understood the truth about Taake, and he clearly has very little patience left for the people who continue pushing those accusations. But whether you agree with Hoest's frustration or not, the controversies show how difficult it becomes to separate artistic provocation from public reputation once those images and accusations enter the wider world. And again, this is where Hoest's own words become important. I asked him about black metal, taboo, and the way outsiders often judge the genre through a moral or political frameworks. His answer was one of the clearest statements he gave me. In Norwegian he wrote, Black metal en avgrunn av en kunstform som konsekvent avfeier alle former for tabutenkning. In English, he is saying, black metal is an abyss of an art form that consistently dismisses all forms of taboo thinking. That sentence explains a lot about how Hoest appears to understand black metal. Not as entertainment designed to reassure people, not as music that asks permission, but as an art form built around rejection of religious boundaries, moral boundaries, social comfort, and the idea that certain subject should be protected from artistic attack. And whether someone agrees with that or not, it helps explain the logic behind Taake's controversies. Provocation is not separate from the art. For Hoest, it seems to be part of the language of black metal itself. But the controversies also show the limit of that philosophy. Rejecting taboos does not mean escaping consequences. Once a symbol is used, once a lyric is written, and once an image leaves the stage and enters the wider world, the artist no longer fully controls what it means to the people. That is the tension at the center of this part of Taake's history. Hoest sees black metal as an art form that refuses taboo thinking. Critics see certain symbols and lyrics as crossing a line that cannot be explained away by artistic intent. Both of those realities shape how Taake was received. But this is also where the documentary has to be careful. The controversies became part of Taake's public image, but they were never the whole story. To understand why Taake has endured for more than 30 years, we have to return to the music, the consistency, and the question of what Hoest preserved after Norwegian black metal's first chapter had already become myth. So after all that, we come back to the central question. Why does Taake matter? Because Taake is not usually the first name people mention when they talk about Norwegian black metal. The conversation usually begins with the earliest bands. Mayhem, Burzum, Darkthrone, Emperor, Immortal. The names that helped define the genre before Taake had even released a full-length album. And honestly, that makes sense. Those bands arrived first. Their early albums were groundbreaking. They shaped the sound, the mythology, and the identity of Norwegian black metal at a time when the genre was still becoming itself. When I asked Hoest about Taake's place in relation to those earlier bands, his answer was very clear. He did not try to rewrite history or place Taake before the pioneers. He acknowledged that those first bands created the foundation. He wrote, "Det har alt å gjøre med at disse bandene var tidligst ute, markerte seg med grensesprengende debututgivelser og dermed inspirerte hele sjangeren. Alle som kom etterpå, inkludert Taake, skylder disse bandene alt." In English, it has everything to do with the fact that these bands came first, made their mark with groundbreaking debut releases, and thereby inspired the entire genre. Everyone who came after, including Taake, owes these bands everything. And I think that's important, because this documentary is not to try to argue that Taake invented Norwegian black metal. It didn't. Taake's significance is different. To understand Taake is not to understand where Norwegian black metal began. It is to understand what happened after the beginning, after the headlines and the scandals. Hoest took this artistic language, the coldness, the aggression, the atmosphere, the rejection, the connection to Norwegian landscape and history, and carried it forward for more than 30 years. This is not the same thing as being first, but it matters, because a genre does not survive only through the people who created it. It survives through the people who keep finding new meaning inside it. And that is what Taake stands out. The music stayed connected to traditional Norwegian black metal, but it never felt like a museum piece. The rawness, the atmosphere, and the Norwegian language stayed. But the music also kept moving. The riffs became more winding and expressive. The albums brought in unexpected instruments and textures. The production changed. The songwriting expanded. Taake preserved the spirit without freezing in time. And that balance is hard to maintain. If you change too much, you lose the identity. And if you change too little, you become a tribute to yourself. Hoest somehow managed to keep Taake recognizable while still allowing it to breathe. This is why the regional identity matters so much. Bergen and Western Norway are not just background details in this story. They are part of the sound. Earlier, Hoest described growing up in his family's old farm, in a valley between a forested mountain, a lake, and the sea. That description stayed with me because it explains something that is hard to put into words. Taake does not sound like a band using Norway as an aesthetic. It sounds like a band that could only have come from there. And maybe that is the best way to frame Taake's place in black metal. The first generation created the mythology. Taake helped prove that the music could keep living after the mythology had already been written. That is why Taake matters. Because to understand Taake is not to understand where Norwegian black metal began. It is to understand how one artist spent more than 30 years preserving and refining the vision it left behind.